Hi there, this is Malendinarius, and today I want to talk to you about pronunciation wars. We students of Latin are in the middle of a war, and it's a war that's been going on since the 1880s or so, a bit earlier, and it's the war between traditional pronunciations and restored classical pronunciation. If you were a traveller across Europe in the 1700s, 1800s, you would have found something odd. If you spoke to somebody who learned Latin in England, they would pronounce Latin in a very peculiar way. If you went to France, they would pronounce Latin differently, Italy differently yet again, Bulgaria differently yet again, Hungary differently, Russia differently. Every single location in Europe had its own local pronunciation, which had developed over time, influenced by the local languages and local pronunciations, and to that extent that sometimes it was very hard for someone from one part of Europe to understand somebody from another part of Europe, even though both of them were speaking Latin. What is now called the Ecclesiastical pronunciation, the church pronunciation, did not exist in the sense that there was no one talked about Ecclesiastical Latin. There was Continental Latin, and then there was restored classical Latin. If you look at all the older textbooks, this is how they describe the situation. It's only very recently that things have sort of condensed down to these two main pronunciation schemes, which and a few of the continental ones still persist. The idea behind restored classical was to reconstruct the pronunciation of the ancient Romans. Now, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, people knew how the Romans spoke. If you look at all the grammars, pronunciation schemes for Roman pronunciation was given, and people said, well, we don't actually use this, but this is how the Romans spoke. It was known that the Romans said w for v, they said k for s, t was always t, etc. Each letter had its own sound, and the sound was constant. The main issue came with pronouncing and reading poetry. Classical Latin is articulated with long syllables and short syllables, and vowels that are long and vowels that are short. If you just pronounce it in a stressed-based manner, which was the way that Latin was pronounced in the traditional continental systems, then Roman poetry no longer works, and you have to do something odd, which is to move the stress from its natural position if you want to read Latin poetry and stick it in a different place. So you'd say arma, virunque, cano, troia, etc. And you'd stick the accent in a strange place. No Roman ever spoke like that, and if you had read poetry to an ancient Roman like that, they would have gone, what are you doing? It's arma, virunque, cano, troia, qui primus aboris Italiam fato profagus, etc. And there's a strong virile rhyme, and the ictus is subauditur. The rhythm underlies the poem. It's a bit like a duck, which you see floating along the pond, and underneath it's paddling away. And the rhythm is there, driving the duck forwards regularly, but the natural language pattern is preserved in the poem. If you use a traditional stressed-based pronunciation, then it's almost impossible to read Roman poetry in the way that the author of that poem intended it to be heard. People grow up listening to their particular type of Latin. For example, if a teacher teaches using a traditional pronunciation scheme, their students will get used to that. Italians are used to learning Latin and speaking it as though it were Italian, but it isn't Italian. And very few Italians bother to learn about restored classical pronunciation. In England, in the 1800s, late 1800s, a decision was made by the Association of Classical Teachers, pretty much unanimously, to teach the restored classical pronunciation. And so across schools, in the English-speaking world, that pronunciation has now pretty much kicked out the old traditional pronunciation. You still find it. For example, when we use Latin in English, we say cacti, right? Spiriti for spiriti, right? Etc. And pater for pater, and that kind of thing. That pronunciation is pretty much extinct. The pronunciation that is now called ecclesiastical pronunciation is, that noise you can hear, by the way, is the windows moving because there's a storm outside. Very strong winds are blowing. The church pronunciation that's now used essentially is the pronunciation of the local pronunciation of Rome. Before the unification of Italy, there were lots of pronunciations of Latin across Italy. In Naples, they pronounced it one way, in Tuscany in another, in Milan differently, and in Rome in the Roman way. But in this modern world of ours, where everything gets conflated, everything gets condensed, everything gets standardized, so too has the church pronunciation become, in the English-speaking world, standardized to the pronunciation of modern Italian, speaking Latin as though it were modern Italian and not as though it were Latin at all. This is all well and good. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with using a medieval pronunciation scheme. If one's going to criticize a pronunciation, then it needs to be within the parameters of the pronunciation scheme. And that's fair enough. So, but to criticize one pronunciation scheme using the parameters of another pronunciation scheme makes no sense whatsoever. In my view, the restored classical pronunciation scheme will eventually prevail. Those people who speak Latin, for the most part, are learning and using restored classical pronunciation. And in the English-speaking world, anyway, within the United Kingdom, within the former colonies, and in America, where a form of restored classical called American Scholastic pronunciation, which is a slightly simplified version of restored classical, keeping most of the elements in place, supposedly to make it easier to teach in schools, is used. For example, if you go onto the Wheelocks website, you'll find examples there of the American Scholastic pronunciation. The pronunciation I use is that based on Vox Latina by Sidney Allen, and also influenced by writings of Bennett and also Sturtevant. These three are the big beasts when it comes to Latin pronunciation, and those three really are the main authorities in terms of how do we go about speaking Latin and articulating it in a way that if we were thrown back into ancient Rome, we would be understood without any difficulty. It's true there may be odd things here and there, and there were accents in ancient times. A Spanish person speaking Latin did not have the same accent as someone from Rome. Someone from the south of Italy did not speak Latin the same way as someone from Rome. Even someone from the suburbs of Rome did not speak Latin the same way as someone on the Palatine Hill spoke Latin. There were wide varieties of accent. But as a general pronunciation scheme, we are on pretty safe ground. There's almost complete academic consensus about how Latin was pronounced. And in terms of the quality of the vowels, we say that they are similar to the vowels found in Spanish or in Italian. The exact relationship of the vowels to each other is unclear, but once you have a system of vowels and you keep the relationships between each vowel steady, then that works. And as far as the consonants go, we have an enormous amount of writing by the Roman grammarians. There are 6 volumes of collected works of the Roman grammarians of Kyle. That's an enormous amount of material written by the Romans themselves, much of that talking about pronunciation. Then we have transliterations of Latin into Greek, and of course the Greek vowel system is more articulated, and we can tell also what a consonant sounded like. So we know that the Romans said Cicero, they did not say Cicero, and there is no argument about that. We know they said vinum, and they did not say vinum, and there's no argument about that. We can tell long vowels from short vowels, etc. An enormous amount can be learned from transliterations into Greek, and there were also transliterations into other languages, such as a number of Latin words that find their way into Hebrew text also, and from there we can reconstruct to some degree how they sounded from the way that they are written down in another language, phonetically. I'm not going to go into a great discussion here about the small details of how we reconstruct ancient Latin, but just to say that there are two main pronunciation schemes. The so-called ecclesiastical Latin that people talk about, especially Americans, should correctly be referred to as continental pronunciations in plural, because there are still very many of them. The French traditional pronunciation is not the same as the Italian traditional pronunciation, and the Spanish traditional pronunciation even today differs from the Roman traditional medieval pronunciation. If you live in Bucharest, your pronunciation scheme will be different. If you're in Romania, your pronunciation scheme will again be slightly different. One thing though, if you are speaking restored classical pronunciation and you're speaking with someone from anywhere else in the world in restored classical pronunciation, then you will immediately be understood. Although it's not difficult to flip from one to the other. Restored classical possibly is more demanding because it requires you to memorize which vowels are long by nature, and not merely where the stress falls on any one word. So cogitatio, right? You have to remember that the first O in cogitatio is long, etc. Orationes, atramentum. So it's not just where the accent falls in the word, it's also the articulation of the word. Whereas in a medieval pronunciation, you just say atramentum, not atramentum. And the long vowels totally disappear. So that's the pronunciation wars. If you look over my channel, you'll see every now and then people get greatly incensed and they get very excited about V's and W's, and they get excited about K's and T's and the ch sound and the yes sound, and it's all really irrelevant. All pronunciations of Latin are good. What is really important is that you're studying Latin and taking it seriously and are interested in it. And whatever pronunciation scheme you choose, do it well. That's all. Bye.